You wake up in a forge that still remembers it was once a shrine. No chains, no screams, just the relentless hymn of pistons pounding like a god and #39's heartbeat and the acrid tang of sanctified oil searing your lungs. The Iron Saints dawn and #39T torture prisoners. They dawn and #39T even pity them. They just perfect them. They calibrate. They excise. And when the flesh proves irredeemable, they dawn and #39T kill you. They reforge you deeper inside the machine, so deep you forget you were ever frail. What happens when a saint decides your weakness is the only sin worth preserving forever? My name is Kale Draven, and I am an acolyte of the Ordo Xenos, sworn to the Inquisition, trained in the identification and eradication of alien threats to the Imperium of Man. I have stood in the ruins of craftworlds and traced the migration patterns of Krut through contaminated hive districts. I have interrogated Ork mercenaries and catalogued the behavioral patterns of Rangdan parasites preserved in stasis vaults beneath the Tricorn Palace. My life has been a devotional exercise in understanding the Xenos' mind so that I might better serve humanity and #39's survival. Yet nothing in my years of service, nothing in the archives or the whispered accounts of veteran interrogators prepared me for the place where I now found myself. Nothing could have prepared me for the canticle. The canticle was not absence. It was imposition. It was a thing that filled the space around me with such totality that it became a physical pressure against my eardrums, my skin, the soft tissues of my throat. I tried to swallow and found the action strangely delayed, as though my body were moving through sanctified syrup. My eyes opened, or perhaps they had been open all along, and I saw only blackness so complete it seemed to have circuitry. I could feel my heart beating slow and rhythmic, but the sound of it did not reach my ears. I could feel the rise and fall of my chest, but I could not hear the passage of air through my nostrils. The canticle was architectural. It had been designed. I tried to move my hand and felt resistance. Not the hard resistance of shackles or restraints, but something tighter, something that interfaced incrementally as I pressed against it. The sensation reminded me of pushing through neural webbing or of moving within a servosuit, though I could breathe without difficulty. My fingers brushed against a surface that was neither warm nor cold, neither rough nor smooth. It simply existed, adaptive and unyielding, a boundary between my flesh and whatever lay beyond. I traced the contours of this clamp and realized it encased me entirely, a sarcophagus that followed the shape of my body with disturbing precision. I was suspended within it, held in place by forces I could not identify, forces that seemed to operate on principles entirely divorced from human understanding. My mind, trained to observe and categorize, began its work automatically. I took inventory of my circumstances with the methodical detachment that had been drilled into me during my years of service. I was alive. I was conscious. I retained memory of my identity and my purpose. These were not small mercies. I had seen what became of men subjected to certain Mechanicus rites. Their minds unraveled like thread from a spool. Their identities dissolved into screaming fragments. That I could still think, still reason, suggested that whatever had captured me wanted me intact. This thought brought no comfort. I remembered the mission. We had been tracking a signal, a low-frequency emission detected by Augur. Arrays in the Ghoul Stars, a region notorious for its disappearances and its machine-haunted silences. My interrogator, a woman named Hestia Vaughn, had theorized it might be a Xenos relic or perhaps a forbidden STC fragment corrupted by tech heresy. We had taken a small vessel, a Cobra-class destroyer, with minimal crew, and translated into the region with our Geller fields at maximum integrity. The Approach had been uneventful. The signal had grown stronger as we neared its source. A dead world, orbiting a dying star, its surface scarred by ancient impacts and covered in what appeared to be Gothic spires too regular to be natural. We had made planetfall in a Valkyrie, myself and 3 others, Vaughn, a tech priest named Korvax, and a sanctioned psyker called Islan. The structures on the surface had been vast beyond comprehension. Cathedral forges that rose from the rust like the vertebrae of buried saints. They were iron black, utterly black, and they seemed to drink the light from our illuminators. Korvax had identified the material as some form of adamantium alloy, a substance that defied analysis, that self-repaired when damaged, and that hummed with energies his instruments could not properly measure. We had proceeded with extreme caution, weapons drawn, aware that we were treading ground where others had vanished without trace. I remembered descending into one of the structures, following a passage that sloped downward at a precise angle, its walls covered in glyphs that hurt to look at directly. The glyphs had seemed to move when viewed peripherally, shifting and recombining in patterns that suggested binaric cant but resisted interpretation. Islan had begun to mutter prayers, her voice thin and strained, and Vaughn had ordered her to maintain silence. The air had grown colder as we descended, cold enough that our breath misted before us, cold enough that frost began to form on the metal surfaces of our weapons. Korvax had noted a sharp decrease in ambient radiation and a corresponding increase in what he called temporal distortion, though he could not explain what he meant by that. Then there had been light. Not the warm light of fire or the harsh light of lumens, but a blue radiance that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. A light that cast no shadows and that made my eyes water. I had raised my hand to shield my face, and in that moment, I had seen them. Figures tall and armored, their forms clad in the same iron black as the walls around us, their eyes glowing with that terrible blue luminescence from optic implants. They had not moved quickly. They had not needed to. One moment they were distant, the next they were upon us, and I had felt something cold pierce through my chest. Not pain exactly, but a sensation of profound excision, as though my body were being catalogued at the cellular level. I remembered falling. I remembered Vaughn screaming. I remembered the sound of Korvax's mechadendrites thrashing against ceramite. I remembered Islan's psychic scream, a pulse of raw terror that had struck my mind like a hammer. And then I remembered nothing until I woke in the canticle, in the darkness, in the clamp that held me suspended like a relic in a reliquary. How long had I been here? The question tormented me because I could find no answer. My chrono had stopped, its display blank, and I had no sense of time's passage. I might have been unconscious for hours or for centuries. There was no way to know. The Iron Saints, for I knew now with cold certainty what had taken me, operated on time scales that dwarfed human comprehension. They were zealots of the machine god, forged in the shadow of Mars, ancient beyond measure, and utterly transhuman in their thought processes. They had been flesh once, or so the forbidden texts claimed. But they had traded their frailty for iron in bodies of living alloy. And in doing so, they had lost something essential, something that made life worth living. They were the Iron Saints of Forge Worlds, the Lords of Augmentation, and they viewed unaugmented life with the same detached judgment that a Forge Master might view flawed or under a magnifier. I was a specimen. The realization settled over me like a shroud. I was not a prisoner in any conventional sense. There would be no interrogation, no torture, no attempt to extract information or to break my will. I was an object of refinement, a data point in some vast and incomprehensible rite. The clamp that held me was not a cell, but a crucible, a means of preservation. I was being kept alive, kept conscious so that I might be observed. The thought should have driven me to panic, but my training held. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to maintain control over my thoughts and my emotions. Panic would accomplish nothing. Fear was a luxury I could not afford. If I was to survive, if I was to escape, I would need to understand my captors, to learn the rules of this place, to identify weaknesses that I might exploit. The Iron Saints were powerful, but they were not infallible. They were machines in flesh, and machines could be understood, could be predicted, could be broken. I began to test the limits of my prison. I pushed against the clamp with my hands, my feet, my shoulders, applying steady pressure to gauge its resilience. It yielded slightly under force, but sprang back when I relaxed, maintaining its shape with eerie consistency. I tried to tear it with my fingernails and found the material impervious to such crude attempts. I attempted to generate heat through friction, rubbing my hands together vigorously, but the clamp seemed to absorb the warmth, keeping the ambient temperature around me constant. I held my breath for as long as I could, curious to see if suffocation might trigger some response, but air continued to circulate somehow, seeping through the clamp in quantities precisely calibrated to my needs. Every action I took was monitored. I realized every movement, every physiological change was being recorded and analyzed. I was not alone in my captivity. Even though I could see no one, I was being watched by intelligences that never slept, that never blinked, that processed information with speed and accuracy beyond human capacity. The prison itself was the Watcher. The walls were auspex. The canticle was a database, constantly updating. Time became meaningless. I tried to maintain a sense of its passage by counting my breaths, by marking off imaginary intervals in my mind, but the effort proved futile. My body gave me no reliable signals. I felt neither hunger nor thirst, neither the urge to relieve myself, nor the exhaustion that should have accompanied extended consciousness. Whatever sustained me operated outside normal biological parameters. I began to suspect that my metabolism had been slowed or perhaps suspended entirely. My cells maintained in a state of perpetual stasis while my mind continued to function. It was a disturbing thought that my body might be frozen while my consciousness persisted, trapped in iron like the ancient saints preserved in the reliquaries of Terra. I tried to sleep but found I could not. My eyes would close, my mind would drift, but true unconsciousness eluded me. Instead, I entered a state of half-awareness, a dim twilight where thoughts moved sluggishly and memories surfaced unbidden. I saw faces from my past. My mentor Drone, who had recruited me into the Ordos, my sister Kayla, who had died during the plague of unbelief. The nameless thralls who had served aboard our vessel, their lives expendable in the service of the Emperor. I saw the cities I had visited, the worlds I had walked, the horrors I had witnessed. The memories were vivid, almost painfully so, and I wondered if the prison was somehow stimulating my neural pathways, harvesting my experiences for analysis. Then the light changed. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible shift in the quality of the darkness around me. The blackness became less absolute, thinning to reveal shapes and forms that had been invisible before. I realized that I was not alone. There were others here, suspended as I was, held in their own clamps, arranged in rows that extended beyond my line of sight. Some were human, their faces slack and their eyes closed, their bodies held in positions of supplication or agony. Others were abhuman, with their elongated features and their warped proportions. Ogrins massive and brutish even in repose. Creatures I could not identify. Their anatomies so strange that I could not determine which end was the head and which the tail. We were a collection, a menagerie, a gallery of specimens drawn from across the Imperium. Each one preserved and catalogued. Each one held in perfect stasis while unseen observers studied our forms and recorded our data. The scale of it was staggering. There were hundreds of us, perhaps thousands, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that spoke of obsessive order and meticulous classification. I could see labels beneath some of the clamps, glyphs in the same incomprehensible script I had seen in the passages above, notations that might have indicated purity or flaw or some other taxonomic detail. I looked for Vaughn, for Korvax, for Islan. Scanning the faces I could see, desperate for some sign of my companions, I found nothing. Either they were elsewhere in this vast collection, or they had not been preserved at all. The thought filled me with a hollow ache. We had been a team, bound by oaths and by shared purpose. And now I was alone among strangers, separated from those I knew by barriers I could not cross. A sound interrupted my observations. It was faint, barely audible even in the profound canticle, a whirring that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rhythm was regular, mechanical, like the ticking of a chronometer magnified 1,000 times. As I listened, the sound grew louder, and with it came a sensation of pressure, a feeling that the very air around me was being compressed. The clamp that held me began to vibrate, a gentle oscillation that spread through my entire body. And I realized with mounting dread that something was happening, some process was beginning. The light brightened. The blue radiance that suffused the space intensified, becoming almost blinding, and I had to squint against its glare. Through narrowed eyes, I saw movement. Figures approaching, tall and impossibly broad, their bodies composed of segmented ceramite that moved with fluid precision. Iron Saints, 3 of them, walking in perfect synchronization, their footsteps making no sound despite the deckplates beneath them. They carried devices I could not identify, tools or instruments that glowed with the same blue light as their optics, and they moved through the rows of suspended specimens with the efficiency of artisans at work. They stopped before one of the human captives, a man whose face was contorted in an expression of frozen terror. One of the Iron Saints reached out with a multi-jointed mechadendrite and touched the clamp, and the material dissolved instantly, peeling away like slag in a forge. The man's body sagged, suddenly unsupported, but he did not fall. Instead, he hung suspended by some invisible force, his limbs dangling, his head lolling forward. The Iron Saints circled him, their instruments scanning his form from multiple angles, recording information that streamed through the air as flickering bands of light. They worked in silence, their movements precise and unhurried, displaying no emotion, no interest, no recognition that the object of their study was a living being. After several minutes, they moved on. The clamp reformed around the man, sealing him once more in his prison, and the Iron Saints proceeded to the next specimen, an abhuman woman with pallid skin and augmetic scars. The process repeated. Dissolution of the clamp, scanning and recording, restoration. The Iron Saints moved from captive to captive with mechanical efficiency, studying each one in turn, never speaking, never deviating from their routine. I watched them approach my position with a fear I could not suppress. My training, my discipline, my years of service, all of it crumbled in the face of this absolute helplessness. I could not move, could not resist, could not even cry out. I was an object to them. No different from the abhumans or the ogrins or the unidentifiable creatures. My humanity meant nothing. My oath to the Emperor meant nothing. I was data, nothing more. They reached my clamp. One of them extended its mechadendrite toward me, and I felt the barrier begin to dissolve. Cool air touched my skin, and the pressure that had held me in place vanished. I fell forward, or would have fallen if not for the invisible force that caught me, suspending me in the same manner as the others. I tried to speak, to demand answers, to assert my identity, but no sound emerged. My vocal cords would not respond. My mouth would not open. I was paralyzed completely, held by forces I could not resist. The scanning began. I felt nothing physically, no pain or discomfort, but I was aware of the process on some deeper level, a sense of violation that went beyond the merely physical. It was as though layers were being peeled away from my being, as though I were being examined, not just externally, but internally, down to the level of individual cells, individual atoms. The Iron Saints circled me, their instruments humming with barely audible vibrations, their optics fixed on me with a detached focus of surgeons at work. I tried to think, to plan, to find some way to resist or escape, but my thoughts moved slowly, as though wading through thick oil. The pressure in the air increased, becoming almost suffocating, and I realized that they were doing something to my mind, probing the structures of my brain, mapping the neural pathways that held my memories and my identity. They were reading me, downloading the contents of my consciousness as though I were nothing more than a cogitator databank. The violation was absolute. Images flashed through my awareness, my training, my missions, my beliefs, my fears. I saw the faces of those I had killed in the service of the Inquisition, the xenos I had eradicated, the heretics I had purged. I saw Vaughn interrogating a genestealer cultist, her voice cold and implacable. I saw Korvox dissecting a Tyranid organism, his mechadendrites working with surgical precision. I saw Islan communing with the Emperor's tarot, her face illuminated by psychic light. Every memory, every thought, every secret, all of it was being harvested, catalogued, stored for purposes I could not fathom. And then it stopped. The scanning ceased as abruptly as it had begun, and the Iron Saints withdrew their instruments. The clamp reformed around me, sealing me once more in my prison, and the paralysis lifted. I could move again, though the clamp still constrained me. I could breathe, could think, could feel. The Iron Saints moved on to the next specimen without pause, without acknowledgement, as though I had already been forgotten. But I had not been forgotten. I understood that now. I had been processed. I had been added to their database, my existence reduced to information, to data points in some vast and incomprehensible analysis. Whatever the Iron Saints were doing here, whatever experiment they were conducting, I was now a part of it, whether I wished it or not. The realization brought a strange clarity. If I was data, then I could be studied. If I could be studied, then perhaps I could be understood. And if I could be understood, then perhaps there were patterns I could identify, rules I could learn, weaknesses I could exploit. The Iron Saints operated according to logic, to programming, to protocols that had been established thousands of years ago by minds that no longer existed in flesh. They were not creative. They were not adaptable. They followed their directives with absolute fidelity. And in that fidelity might lie the seeds of their downfall. I began to observe. I watched the Iron Saints as they moved through the collection, noting the patterns in their behavior, the regularity of their routines. They came at intervals that seemed consistent, though I had no way to measure time with precision. They always arrived in groups of 3. They always followed the same path through the specimens. They always performed the same scanning procedures. There was no variation, no improvisation. They were machines executing a program, and machines could be predicted. I also observed my fellow captives. Most remained unconscious, their faces slack, their bodies unmoving, but a few showed signs of awareness. I saw an Ogren whose eyes tracked the Iron Saints as they passed, his massive fists clenching and unclenching within his clamp. I saw an Abhuman whose lips moved silently, forming words I could not hear, perhaps prayers or curses directed at his captors. I saw a human woman whose face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and desperate, her body trembling with barely suppressed panic. We were not all equally affected by the stasis. Some of us retained more consciousness than others, more awareness of our circumstances. I wondered if this was intentional. If the Iron Saints had deliberately maintained different levels of awareness in their specimens to observe how we reacted to refinement, it would fit their methodology, their obsessive need to catalog every variable, every outcome, every permutation of cause and effect. The thought gave me an idea. If the Iron Saints were studying our reactions, then perhaps I could use that to my advantage. Perhaps I could alter my behavior in ways that might interest them, that might prompt them to change their procedures or to move me to a different location. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation was all I had. I began to move within my clamp, systematically testing its limits, pressing against it at different points, applying varying degrees of force. I tried to create patterns, sequences of movement that might register as anomalous, that might flag me as worthy of additional study. Nothing happened. The Iron Saints returned on their regular schedule and scanned me as they scanned all the others, showing no particular interest in my activities. I was one data point among thousands, unremarkable and insignificant. My attempts at communication, at attracting attention, were as futile as shouting into a void. But I persisted. What else could I do? To give up, to surrender, to despair would be to betray everything I had sworn to uphold. I was an acolyte of the Ordo Xenos, a servant of the God Emperor of mankind. And I would not submit meekly to transhuman captivity. Even if escape proved impossible, Even if I was doomed to remain in this place until my body finally failed, I would maintain my resistance. I would remain human. I would remain myself. The captives around me began to change slowly, imperceptibly at first, but with growing clarity as time passed. The Ogren I had observed grew thinner, his massive frame withering, his muscles atrophying despite the stasis that should have preserved him. The abhuman skin took on a grayish pallor, and his eyes, once bright with intelligence, dimmed to lifeless orbs. The human woman stopped trembling, her body going completely still, and I wondered if she had finally succumbed to madness or to death. We were dying. All of us, despite the technology that sustained us, despite the care with which we were maintained, the stasis was not perfect. It could slow biological processes, but not halt them entirely. And over time, over the vast stretches of time that the Iron Saints measured their existence in, we would degrade, would decay, would eventually cease to function. We were samples with expiration dates, and when we expired, we would be discarded, replaced by fresh specimens drawn from whatever unfortunate souls next stumbled into Iron Saints territory. The thought filled me with rage. Not the hot impulsive rage that drove men to violence, but a cold, calculated anger that sharpened my mind and focused my will. I would not be discarded. I would not be forgotten. I would find a way out of this place, or I would die trying, but I would not passively accept my fate. The Iron Saints had made a mistake in keeping me conscious, in allowing me to observe, to think, to plan. They had underestimated human tenacity, human stubbornness, human refusal to accept the inevitable. I began to pay closer attention to the structure of my prison. The clamp that held me was uniform in appearance, but I suspected it was not uniform in strength. There must be weak points, seams, where the material joined, places where it interfaced with the mechanisms that generated it. I ran my fingers along every surface I could reach, feeling for irregularities, for variations in texture or temperature. I pressed against different areas with varying degrees of force, testing for give or flexibility. I used my teeth to bite at the material, my nails to scrape at it, my body weight to strain against it. The clamp resisted all my efforts, but I learned from each attempt. I learned that it was stronger near the edges and weaker toward the center. I learned that it responded to sudden pressure differently than to sustained pressure. I learned that it conducted heat poorly, creating zones of temperature differential that might be exploited. None of this knowledge brought me closer to escape, but it gave me hope, and hope was a weapon sharper than any blade. The Iron Saints came again, and this time I did something different. When they scanned me, when they probed my mind with their instruments, I did not resist. Instead, I opened myself to the process, allowing my thoughts to flow freely, deliberately thinking about escape, about resistance, about every weakness I had identified in my prison. I flooded their senses with information, with planning, with intent, curious to see if they would react, if they would recognize the threat I represented. They did not. They completed their scan and moved on, showing no indication that they had registered anything unusual. Either they did not recognize human cognitive patterns well enough to identify planning and intent, or they did not care. I suspected the latter. To the Iron Saints, my thoughts were just more data, no different from my heart rate or my cellular composition. Intent was irrelevant. Only measurable phenomena mattered. But there was something else. Something I noticed during that scan. A flicker in the blue light, a momentary dimming that lasted less than a second. The instruments the Iron Saints carried wavered slightly, their glow becoming unstable before returning to normal. The Iron Saints themselves paused, their movements stuttering almost imperceptibly before resuming their routine. It was a glitch, a minor malfunction, the kind of thing that might occur in any complex system. But it was the first sign I had seen that the Iron Saints and their technology were not absolutely perfect. I filed this observation away, adding it to my growing collection of details. The Iron Saints experienced malfunctions. Their systems were subject to errors, however minor. This meant they could be disrupted. This meant they were vulnerable. I just needed to understand how. The next time the light changed, revealing the full extent of the collection, I focused my attention not on my fellow captives, but on the infrastructure around us. The chamber we occupied was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness far above, its walls smooth and featureless, except for the glyphs that covered them in dense arrays. But there were other features, subtle ones, that I had not noticed before. Conduits ran along the floor and walls, channels through which energy flowed, visible as faint lines of blue luminescence. Pylons rose at regular intervals, tall columns that hummed with barely audible vibrations, their surfaces inscribed with the same glyphs that covered the walls. And overhead, suspended in the darkness, were larger structures, platforms or control systems, their purpose unclear, but their importance suggested by their size and complexity. Everything was connected. The clamps, the pylons, the conduits, the platforms, all of it formed a single integrated system, a network of staggering sophistication. And networks, I knew from my training, had nodes. They had junction points where multiple connections converged, places that represented bottlenecks or vulnerabilities. If I could identify such a node, if I could find a way to disrupt it, I might be able to cascade that disruption throughout the system, creating enough chaos to facilitate escape. But how? I was imprisoned, powerless, lacking tools or weapons or any means of affecting the world beyond my clamp. I could think, could observe, could plan, but I could not act. I needed leverage, some way to translate my knowledge into action, and I could not see how to obtain it. The answer came from an unexpected source. The abhuman I had observed, the one whose lips had moved in silent speech, suddenly went rigid within his clamp. His eyes flew open, wide and unseeing, and his mouth gaped in a soundless scream. His body convulsed, thrashing against the constraints of his prison, and I saw arcs of energy crackling across his skin, tiny lightning bolts that danced and flickered. He was manifesting psychic power, I realized, drawing on the energies of the warp despite his imprisonment. Despite the technology that surrounded him, the Iron Saints responded immediately. More of them appeared, materializing out of the darkness with their teleportation technology, converging on the abhuman's position. They extended their instruments toward him, and beams of blue light lanced out, striking his clamp and causing it to glow with intense brightness. The abhuman's convulsions intensified, his body arching backward at an impossible angle, and then he went limp, the energy fading from around him. The Iron Saints held their positions for several moments, scanning him repeatedly, ensuring that the anomaly had been suppressed. Then they withdrew, dematerializing as suddenly as they had arrived, and the chamber returned to its previous state. But something had changed. I had seen the Iron Saints react with urgency, with something approaching concern when faced with psychic manifestation. They feared the warp, or at least recognized it as a threat to their systems, a force that could disrupt their carefully ordered reality. This was useful information. This was a potential weakness. But I was not a psyker. I had no ability to manipulate warp energies, no connection to that realm of nightmares and madness. Islan had been our psyker, and Islan was gone, lost or dead or imprisoned elsewhere. I could not replicate what the abhuman had done. I could not generate psychic phenomena to disrupt the Iron Saints. Or could I? I thought back to my training, to the lessons on xenopsychology and biology that Drone had drilled into me. Psykers drew their power from the warp. But the warp existed everywhere, permeating all of reality like a parallel dimension. It was strongest in places where emotion ran high, where belief was fervent, where consciousness was concentrated. And this chamber held thousands of conscious beings, thousands of minds that experienced fear, desperation, rage, all the emotions that fed the warp and made it turbulent. What if I could amplify those emotions? What if I could somehow link the minds of the captives, creating a collective resonance that might breach the barriers between real space and the warp? It was a mad idea, but madness and genius often walked hand in hand. The Iron Saints had suppressed individual manifestations, but could they suppress a collective one? Could they contain the psychic pressure of thousands of terrified minds, all focusing their anguish in the same direction at the same moment? I had no idea how to accomplish such a thing. I had no psychic ability, no means of directly affecting other minds. But I could move, could make myself visible to my fellow captives, if I could attract their attention, if I could communicate with them somehow, perhaps I could coordinate action, could inspire them to focus their emotions together rather than suffering in isolation. I began to move within my clamp with renewed vigor, creating patterns that might be noticed, creating rhythms that might convey meaning. I raised my hands and pressed them against the barrier, fingers splayed, making myself as visible as possible. I mouthed words silently, repeating them over and over. Resist. Fight. Focus. Unite. I had no idea if anyone could see me, if anyone would understand, but I persisted. Slowly, painfully slowly, I saw responses. The human woman whose face had been streaked with tears turned her head in my direction, her eyes focusing on me with sudden clarity. An ogren several rows away began to pound his fists against his clamp, the vibrations spreading through the structure. Another human, a man I had not noticed before, began to move in patterns that mirrored my own, picking up the rhythm I had established. We were communicating, crude and clumsy though it was, we were reaching across the barriers that separated us. The Iron Saints did not immediately respond. They continued their routine, their scans, their mechanical efficiency. But I could sense a change in the atmosphere, a building tension that had not been present before. The captives who had been unconscious began to stir, their bodies twitching, their faces contorting. Those who had been aware became more active, their movements more coordinated, more purposeful. We were waking up, all of us, drawn together by some instinct older than language. The herd instinct that drives prey animals to band together when predators approach. And then the pain began. It was not physical pain, though it manifested in physical symptoms. It was a pressure inside my skull, a sensation of expansion, as though my brain was swelling against the confines of my cranium. I felt my consciousness stretching, thinning, becoming diffuse and permeable. Barriers that normally kept my thoughts private and contained began to dissolve, and I became aware of other minds, other consciousnesses pressing against mine, overlapping with mine. The human woman's terror flooded through me. The ogren's rage became my rage. The abhuman's despair washed over me in waves. We were merging, our consciousnesses bleeding together, forming something larger than the sum of our parts. It was horrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I could feel myself dissolving, losing my individual identity, becoming part of a collective entity that encompassed thousands of disparate minds. And with that merging came power, warp energy bleeding through the cracks in reality, drawn by the intensity of our combined emotions. The Iron Saints noticed. How could they not? The blue radiance that suffused the chamber began to flicker and dim, overwhelmed by a different light, a writhing multicolored luminescence that seemed to boil up from the floor and cascade down from the ceiling. The pylons that maintained the system began to vibrate violently, their structures stressed beyond tolerance. Alarms sounded, harsh electronic tones that cut through the canticle, and more Iron Saints appeared, dozens of them, then hundreds, all converging on our location with their instruments raised. They fired their suppression beams, lances of blue light that struck the clamps and caused them to flare with blinding intensity. But the warp energy continued to build, fed by our collective consciousness, growing stronger with every passing moment. I could feel it threatening to tear reality apart, to open a rift that would swallow this entire facility and everything in it. The Iron Saints redoubled their efforts. More beams lancing out, more instruments brought to bear. But they were fighting a tide that could not be stemmed. And then something changed. The quality of the light shifted. The warp energy suddenly contracting, compressing, being drawn inward rather than expanding outward. I felt the collective consciousness begin to fragment, individual minds being forcibly separated, barriers being re-erected between us. The pressure in my skull eased, and my sense of self reasserted itself, pushing back the foreign thoughts and emotions that had flooded through me. The warp energy dissipated, not in an explosion, but in a sudden vacuum, sucked away by forces I could not identify. The Iron Saints had countered our assault. They had deployed some technology, some weapon or system that specifically targeted warp phenomena that created zones of null space where psychic energy could not exist. The pylons, I realized, seeing them with new understanding. The pylons were not just power conduits or structural supports. They were warp suppressors, devices that enforced the laws of physics that prevented the intrusion of the Imperium into real space. The Iron Saints had built their prisons specifically to contain not just physical bodies, but also psychic potential to ensure that no warp-based escape was possible. We had failed. Our desperate gambit had accomplished nothing except to reveal the full extent of the Iron Saints' preparations. They had anticipated every possibility, had countered every threat, had built redundancy upon redundancy to ensure that their specimens remained contained. There would be no escape through psychic means. There would be no dramatic breakthrough. There would be only the slow degradation, the eventual death, the final discarding of organic material that had outlived its usefulness. The collective consciousness dissolved completely, leaving me alone once more in my clamp, exhausted and despairing. Around me, my fellow captives had gone still, their brief surge of resistance quelled, their bodies limp and unresponsive. The Iron Saints withdrew, their forms dematerializing, and the chamber returned to its previous state, silent and ordered, a perfect machine humming along without disruption. I wanted to scream, to rage, to pound my fists against my prison until my hands broke. But I did none of these things. Instead, I forced myself to think, to analyze what had happened, to extract whatever lessons could be learned. We had failed, yes, but in failing, we had revealed information. We had forced the Iron Saints to deploy systems that might otherwise have remained hidden. We had tested their response protocols and found them wanting in some areas, excessive in others. Knowledge was a weapon. Even knowledge gained through defeat. The pylons were key. They maintained the null zones that prevented psychic activity. If the pylons could be damaged or disrupted, the zones would collapse and warp energy would flood back in. But how could I damage a pylon? I was imprisoned, powerless, lacking any means of affecting physical objects, unless the clamps required power to maintain themselves. That power came from the conduits in the floor and walls, the channels of blue energy that connected everything together, and those conduits ran past the pylons, perhaps even through them. If the power flow could be interrupted, even momentarily, the clamps might collapse. And in that moment of collapse, I might have an opportunity to act. It was a desperate plan contingent on variables I could not control. But it was better than resignation. I needed to understand the power distribution system. I needed to identify which conduits fed which clamps, where the junction points were located, how the network was configured. This required observation, patience, and time. Commodities I possessed in abundance. I began my study, watching the flow of energy through the conduits, noting patterns of brightness and dimness, tracking the pulses that traveled along them at regular intervals. The Iron Saints had built their system with typical precision. Every component measured and calibrated, every connection optimized for efficiency, but efficiency created dependencies, and dependencies created vulnerabilities. Over what might have been days or weeks or months, I mapped the network in my mind, building a mental schematic of how power flowed through the facility. I identified primary conduits and secondary ones, main distribution nodes and backup systems. I learned to recognize the signatures of different subsystems, the steady glow that indicated clamp generation, the pulsing light that accompanied scanning operations, the intermittent flares that occurred when Iron Saints teleported into or out of the chamber. I became intimately familiar with every detail of my prison's infrastructure, and I found what I was looking for. A junction node located approximately 30 m from my position, where multiple conduits converged before splitting off to feed different sections of the collection. It was a bottleneck, a single point through which enormous amounts of power flowed. If that node could be disrupted, if its operation could be interrupted even briefly, cascading failures would ripple through the network, potentially collapsing dozens or hundreds of clamps simultaneously. But I still had no means of reaching the node. It was outside my clamp, beyond the limits of my physical reach, and I could not move myself to a different location. I was trapped in a maze where I could see the exit, but could not walk toward it. Frustration threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed it aside. There had to be a way. There had to be something I had overlooked, some detail I had missed. The answer came not from observation, but from memory. I recalled something Korvax had said during our descent into the Iron Saint structure, a comment about temporal distortion. He had detected anomalies in the flow of time, regions where it moved faster or slower than normal. At the time, I had dismissed it as xenos trickery, irrelevant to our immediate concerns. But now, imprisoned in a facility that operated on principles divorced from human understanding, I reconsidered, what if time in this place was not uniform? What if different regions experienced different rates of temporal passage? I began to test this hypothesis using my own perceptions as measuring instruments. I counted my breaths, my heartbeats, the imaginary seconds that ticked away in my mind. And I noticed something strange. Sometimes my counts matched, breath and heartbeat synchronizing perfectly. Other times they diverged, heartbeats racing ahead of breaths or breaths stretching out endlessly between heartbeats. The discrepancies were small, barely noticeable, but they were consistent enough to suggest that time around me was not flowing smoothly. It stuttered and skipped like a damaged recording. The Iron Saints controlled time, or at least influenced it. Their stasis technology did not merely slow biological processes. It manipulated the temporal framework itself, creating pockets where time moved at different rates. And if time could be slowed, it could presumably be accelerated. If the temporal field around my clamp could be disrupted, if I could cause it to fluctuate wildly, I might experience moments of accelerated time during which I could move faster than the clamps could respond, faster than the Iron Saints could react. But how to disrupt a temporal field? I had no tools, no weapons, no means of generating the energies necessary to affect such fundamental forces. All I had was my body, my mind, and the knowledge I had accumulated. I thought about the psychic surge we had attempted, how it had stressed the system, how the pylons had been forced to activate their suppression fields. What if I could create a smaller, more localized disturbance? What if I could generate enough anomalous activity within my immediate vicinity to force the system to adjust, to recalibrate, and in that moment of adjustment create the temporal fluctuation I needed? I began to move again, but differently than before. Instead of trying to communicate with other captives, I focused all my attention on myself, on creating patterns of activity that would register as anomalous to the scanning systems. I flexed and relaxed my muscles in rapid sequences, creating bursts of bioelectric activity. I altered my breathing, hyperventilating and then holding my breath, forcing my body into states of stress that would produce measurable chemical changes. I thought intensely about specific memories, flooding my neural pathways with activity, then cleared my mind completely, dropping into meditative blankness. I became a chaos generator, producing as much unpredictability as my limited circumstances allowed. Nothing happened immediately. The Iron Saints came and scanned me on their regular schedule, showing no particular interest in my activities. The clamp held me as securely as ever. Time continued to flow at its irregular but unchanging pace. I persisted, refusing to give up, refusing to accept that all my efforts were futile. Even if escape proved impossible, even if I was doomed to remain here until my body failed, I would maintain my resistance. I would continue to be human, to be individual, to be Kale-Draven. And then it happened. During one of my chaotic activity bursts, I felt a shift, a sensation like the universe hiccuping. Time stuttered around me, skipping forward by some immeasurable fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, my body moved without the clamp's constraint. My hand shot forward, striking the barrier with full force, and I felt something give, felt the material tear slightly under the unexpected impact. The clamp immediately repaired itself, but the damage had been done. I had confirmed that temporal fluctuations could create opportunities, however brief, for action. I refined my technique, learning through trial and error which patterns of activity produced the strongest fluctuations. I discovered that sudden changes created larger disruptions than gradual ones, that paradoxical states, holding contradictory thoughts or engaging in conflicting muscle actions stress the system more than simple chaos. I turned myself into a walking paradox, a generator of impossibilities pushing the boundaries of what the temporal stabilization system could accommodate. The fluctuations grew stronger, more frequent. I began to experience moments of accelerated consciousness where seconds stretched into subjective minutes, where I could observe my own biochemistry at work, watching molecules diffuse through membranes and neurons fire in cascading chains. In these moments, I understood with profound clarity just how alien the Iron Saints' understanding of reality was. They perceived existence as a series of discrete states, snapshots taken at infinite decimal intervals and analyzed independently. They did not experience continuous flow, did not have intuitive understanding of change or growth or decay. They were frozen in eternal present, unable to truly comprehend the passage of time that organic life took for granted. This was their weakness. They could manipulate time but did not understand it. They could create stasis but could not prevent the fundamental truth that all systems tend toward entropy. That order inevitably gives way to chaos. Their prison was a monument to their denial of this truth. A desperate attempt to halt the universal march toward heat death. And in that denial lay the seeds of its failure. I intensified my efforts, pushing myself to the limits of what my body could endure. I created resonances, matching the frequency of my activities to the pulse of energy flowing through the conduits, amplifying rather than disrupting. The temporal field around me became increasingly unstable, warping and flexing, creating bubbles where time moved at radically different rates. I experienced moments where I seemed to age years in seconds, my body deteriorating rapidly, followed by moments where I regressed, wounds healing and exhaustion fading. The clamp struggled to compensate, its structure flickering between states of existence, and then the junction node failed. I did not see it happen directly, but I felt the consequences immediately. The steady flow of power through the conduits faltered, stuttering like a damaged heart. The blue radiance dimmed, then flared bright, then settled into a rapid flickering that cast the entire chamber in strobing light. Clamps throughout the collection began to collapse. Their inhabitants suddenly released from stasis. Bodies tumbling to the floor or hanging suspended by residual energy fields. Alarms blared, harsh and insistent, and Iron Saints materialized throughout the chamber, attempting to contain the cascade failure. My clamp dissolved, I fell forward, caught myself on hands and knees, feeling solid ground beneath me for the first time in an eternity. My muscles were weak, atrophied from disuse despite the stasis, but they responded to my will. I pushed myself upright, swaying slightly, my vision swimming as my eyes adjusted to sudden freedom of movement. Around me, chaos reigned. Freed captives staggered and crawled and collapsed. Iron Saints moved among them with their instruments raised, attempting to recapture specimens to restore order to the disrupted collection. I ran. It was more of a stagger than a run, my legs barely supporting my weight. But I moved away from my former position as quickly as I could manage. I had no clear destination, no plan beyond immediate escape from the collection chamber. I simply moved toward the nearest exit, a dark opening in the wall that might have been a passage, or might have been merely a decorative feature. I did not care. Anywhere was better than here. Other captives had the same idea. I found myself part of a ragged stream of humanity and abhumans, all fleeing in the same direction, driven by instinct toward freedom. An Ogren pushed past me, his massive bulk forcing me aside. An abhuman ran with grace that made my own movements seem clumsy and crude. A human woman, the same one whose tears I had seen, grabbed my arm and pulled me forward, lending me her strength when my own threatened to fail. We entered the passage. It sloped upward, its walls smooth and black, its floor marked with glyphs that glowed faintly in the darkness. Behind us, I could hear the Iron Saints pursuing, their footsteps silent, but their presence announced by the blue radiance that preceded them. We ran harder, desperation lending us speed we should not have possessed. The passage branched, offering multiple paths, and our group split, some going left, some right, some continuing straight. I followed the human woman who had helped me, trusting her instincts over my own. The passage narrowed, its walls closing in until we had to move single file. The abhuman who had been running with us suddenly stumbled, a blue beam lancing through the darkness to strike him in the back. He fell without a sound, his body dissolving into ash that scattered in an invisible wind. The woman screamed, a raw sound of terror and rage, and pulled me forward more urgently. We could not stop. We could not look back. We could only run. We emerged into a larger chamber, its dimensions vast, and its purpose unclear. Strange machinery filled the space. Devices whose functions I could not identify. All of them constructed from the same black metal. All of them humming with barely audible vibrations. We ran between them, using them as cover, hiding when blue radiance swept past us, emerging to run again when the danger passed. The woman led and I followed, too exhausted to question, too desperate to hesitate. A doorway appeared ahead. A rectangular opening that led into darkness. We ran toward it, hope surging through me, the possibility of escape suddenly seeming real. We were meters away when the floor beneath us changed, the black metal liquefying, becoming viscous, grabbing at our feet like quicksand. The woman cried out, her legs sinking into the metal, her hands scrabbling for purchase on solid surfaces that did not exist. I reached for her, tried to pull her free, but the metal had my feet as well, was pulling me down with inexorable force. The Iron Saints appeared, 3 of them, approaching with measured strides, their instruments raised but not firing. They watched us struggle with what might have been curiosity or might have been complete indifference. I could not read emotion in those armored faces, could not determine if they felt anything at all. They simply observed as the floor consumed us, drawing us down into itself, the black metal rising up our legs, our waists, our chests. I tried to fight, to pull myself free through sheer force of will, but my strength was gone. The woman beside me had stopped struggling, her face peaceful, as though she had accepted her fate. I envied her that peace. I could not find it within myself. Even as the metal rose past my shoulders, past my chin, even as it covered my mouth and nose and eyes, I continued to fight, continued to resist, continued to remain myself. And then I was drowning in blackness, pulled down into depths that had no bottom, that went on forever. I could not breathe, but I did not suffocate. I could not see, but I was not blind. I was simply suspended in nothingness, in void, in the absolute absence of sensation. Time lost all meaning. Identity became questionable. I was not sure if I still existed or if I had been erased, deleted from reality like a file purged from a databank. Consciousness returned slowly, reluctantly. I became aware first of weight of gravity pulling at my body, indicating that I occupied space, then temperature, cold air against my skin, raising goosebumps. Then light, dim, and blue, filtering through closed eyelids. I opened my eyes and saw blackness, absolute and complete, but shot through with thin lines of luminescence that suggested structure that implied I was somewhere rather than nowhere. I tried to move and found I could. I was no longer held by the clamp, no longer paralyzed by invisible forces. I was lying on a hard surface, cold metal beneath me, and I pushed myself up to sitting, my muscles protesting the movement, but obeying nonetheless. I looked around, trying to determine where I was, what had happened to me. The chamber was smaller than the collection area, more intimate in scale. It contained machinery. I did not recognize devices that might have been medical equipment or torture implements or scientific instruments. The walls were covered in glyphs, denser here than in other areas, the characters tiny and cramped, covering every available surface. A single pylon stood in the center of the space, its structure more elaborate than the others I had seen, its surface etched with additional markings, and suspended before the pylon, held by threads of blue light, was a crystalline structure that pulsed with inner radiance. I was alone. The woman who had been captured with me was nowhere to be seen. Neither were any other captives or any Iron Saints. I had been brought here for some purpose, deposited in this place and left without explanation. The canticle was profound, broken only by the faint humming of machinery, a sound so constant it became almost subliminal. I stood, testing my balance, and found I could walk without difficulty. Whatever had been done to me, whatever process I had undergone, had not damaged my body. If anything, I felt stronger than I had before my escape attempt, as though the stasis had been partially lifted, allowing my muscles to recover from their atrophy. I approached the pylon cautiously, drawn by the crystalline structure it held, curious about its purpose. As I drew closer, I realized the structure was not static. It changed as I watched, its facets rotating, its internal patterns shifting and recombining. It was displaying information, I realized, showing data in a format that transcended language or symbology. And that data was about me. I could see myself reflected in the crystal, not as a visual image, but as a collection of measurements, of values, of quantities that described every aspect of my existence. Height, weight, genetic markers, neural patterns, memories, all of it encoded in the crystal structure. All of it preserved in perfect detail. I was looking at myself from outside myself, seeing what the Iron Saints saw when they studied me. It was disorienting and strangely intimate. This perspective that reduced me to information, to data that could be analyzed and categorized. I wanted to look away, but found I could not. I was transfixed by the revelation of my own quantified existence. The crystal changed. The data about me dissolved, replaced by different information. Data I could not interpret. Patterns that seemed random, but that must have held meaning for those who created them. I watched the display cycle through configurations, each one lasting only moments before giving way to the next. And then I understood this was not just a storage medium. This was a processing system, a computational device that analyzed the data it held, drawing conclusions, making predictions, generating new knowledge from observed patterns. The Iron Saints were not simply collecting specimens. They were analyzing us, searching for something, looking for patterns that connected disparate species, for commonalities that transcended biology and culture. They were trying to understand something fundamental about organic life. Something they had lost when they underwent their transformation into metal bodies. Something they hoped to reclaim or replicate or comprehend. What was it? What could a race of immortal machines possibly want from us that they did not already possess? I thought about what I knew of Iron Saints' history, the fragments and rumors that filled the Inquisition's archives. They had been the Iron Hands once, flesh and blood beings who suffered from the weakness of the body and the frailty of emotion. In desperation, they had made a pact with the machine god, the Omnicia, and had been transformed into machines. But the transformation had not been what they expected. They had gained immortality, but lost their souls, their ability to feel, their connection to the universe as living beings experienced it. They wanted to understand sensation. Not the crude measurement of temperature or pressure that their senses provided, but the subjective experience of feeling, the qualitative difference between hot and cold, the emotional resonance of fear or joy or sorrow. They had built this prison, this collection to observe organic beings and catalog our reactions, hoping that through extensive study they might reverse engineer the algorithms of consciousness, might discover the code that would allow them to feel again. It was a futile quest. Consciousness could not be reduced to algorithm, could not be replicated through computation. It arose from the interaction of matter and energy in configurations so complex that they transcended mere mechanism. The Iron Saints could study us for millions of years and never understand what they had lost, never reclaim what they had given up. They were trapped in a hell of their own creation, eternal and unchanging and utterly alone. I felt pity for them. It was an absurd emotion. Pity for beings who held me captive, who had subjected me to torment and study, who viewed me as nothing more than an experimental animal. But I felt it nonetheless. They were victims of their own choices. Prisoners in bodies that would never decay, but would never truly live. In seeking to escape death, they had embraced something far worse than death. They had embraced meaninglessness. The crystal stopped shifting. Its patterns froze in a configuration I had not seen before, and the blue light that held it intensified. I felt a presence behind me, a weight in the air that suggested someone or something had arrived. I turned and saw an Iron Saint standing in the doorway, but this one was different from the others I had encountered. It was taller, more ornate, its body inscribed with glyphs that glowed with their own internal light. It carried no instruments, bore no obvious weapons, but radiated authority, command, power. It spoke. The sound was not audible in any conventional sense. I heard no voice, no words, no vibrations in the air, but meaning entered my mind directly. Concepts and ideas that bypassed language entirely, transmitted through some form of technological telepathy. The Iron Saint was communicating with me, and the communication was simple, direct, unyielding. I was an experiment that had concluded. My behavior during captivity had provided valuable data, had offered insights into human psychology and neurology that would be added to the vast databases the Iron Saints maintained. But my value as a specimen had been exhausted. The escape attempt, the temporal disruptions, the damage to the collection system, all of it had been factored into the analysis, and the conclusion was clear. I represented a category of high-variance subject, one whose unpredictability introduced too many confounding variables into controlled observations. I was being reclassified, not terminated, not released, but moved to a different category of study. I would be placed in a deeper chamber, in storage more secure and more isolated, where my consciousness would be suppressed more thoroughly, where the temporal fields would be stronger and more stable. I would remain a specimen, a data point, a source of information, but I would no longer be aware of my captivity. I would exist in a state of dreamless sleep, my brain activity monitored, but my subjective experience eliminated. It was, the Iron Saint conveyed with something that might have been irony if machines could feel such things, a mercy. I refused. I told the Iron Saint, projecting my thoughts as clearly as I could, that I would not submit to further imprisonment, that I would resist with every fiber of my being, that I would die before I allowed them to strip away my consciousness. I was Kael Draven, acolyte of the Ordo Xenos, servant of the God Emperor, and I would not surrender my humanity to transhuman machines, no matter what they offered or threatened. The Iron Saint did not respond to my declaration. It simply raised one metal hand, and I felt my body stiffen, muscles locking into place as though I had been turned to stone. I could not move, could not speak, could barely think. The paralysis was absolute, more complete than anything the clamp had imposed. I was a statue, a frozen moment, consciousness trapped in a body that would not obey. The floor liquefied again. This time I did not struggle as it pulled me down. I could not struggle. I could only experience, could only observe as I sank into blackness once more as the world above me receded and disappeared. The last thing I saw was the crystalline structure still pulsing within a light, still displaying data I could not interpret. And then there was nothing. I do not know how long I fell through that darkness. Time had no meaning in that place, if indeed it was a place at all. I simply existed, conscious but disconnected, aware but isolated, a mind floating in void. Occasionally, I would sense other presences, other consciousnesses passing near me, specimens being transported to their designated storage locations. I tried to reach out to them, to communicate, to establish some connection that might anchor me in reality, but the attempts failed. We were each alone, separated by barriers we could not cross. Eventually, the falling stopped. I felt myself settle onto another hard surface. Felt the paralysis lift slightly enough that I could move my eyes, could turn my head fractionally. I was in a new chamber, smaller and darker than the previous one, its walls smooth and featureless. There was no machinery here, no pylons, no crystalline displays. There was only emptiness and silence, and the sense of vast weight pressing down from above, as though I were buried deep beneath the surface of some dead world. A clamp formed around me, materializing out of nothing, sealing me once more in stasis. But this clamp was different. It was opaque, blocking all light, all sensation from the outside world. I was isolated completely, cut off from external stimuli, left alone with only my thoughts for company. And those thoughts began to slow, to become sluggish and disconnected, as though my brain were gradually shutting down. The suppression the Iron Saint had promised was beginning. My consciousness being dampened, my awareness being reduced. I fought it. I focused on memories, on the faces of those I had known, on the missions I had undertaken, on everything that made me who I was. I recited the litany of hatred, the prayers to the Emperor, the oaths I had sworn. I held on to my identity with desperate intensity, refusing to let it slip away, refusing to submit to the erasure they intended. But I was fighting a losing battle. The suppression was relentless, patient, inexorable. One by one, my memories began to fade. Not deleted, but distanced. pushed back into recesses of my mind where I could not access them. I tried to remember Vaughn's face and found I could not. I tried to recall my sister's name and discovered it had been taken from me. I grasped for the words of my oaths, and they slipped through my fingers like water. I was being dismantled, not destroyed, but reduced, simplified, optimized for whatever study the Iron Saints intended. They were pruning away the parts of me that introduced variables that made me unpredictable, that made me human. They were distilling me down to essential elements, stripping away personality and history and identity until only baseline biological responses remained. I would become a perfect specimen, unchanging and reliable, a source of clean data untainted by the noise of lived experience. I could not stop it. I had no tools, no weapons, no leverage. I had only my will, and will alone was not sufficient. The suppression pressed down on me like an ocean, drowning my consciousness in layers of forced tranquility. My thoughts grew quieter, slower, dimmer. The urgency I had felt, the desperate need to resist, began to fade, replaced by a curious detachment. A sense that perhaps this was not so terrible after all, that perhaps it would be restful to simply let go, to surrender, to sleep. I wanted to sleep. I wanted to stop fighting, to accept what was being done to me, to embrace the peace that the suppression offered. It would be so easy to simply close my eyes and drift away, to let the Iron Saints complete their work, to become the specimen they needed me to be. No more fear, no more pain, no more desperate struggles against impossible odds. Just quiet darkness and empty dreams. But something in me refused. Some core of stubbornness, of defiance, of fundamental human contrariness would not yield. I did not know why I continued to resist. I had lost track of my reasons, lost the memories that had motivated me, lost everything except the bare fact of resistance itself. But that was enough. That would have to be enough. I held on to that single truth. I was resisting. I was fighting. I was refusing to comply. It was not much, hardly anything at all. Just a tiny spark of opposition in an ocean of suppression. But it was mine. It belonged to me. It was the last thing that remained of Kael Draven, and I would not let them take it. The suppression reached its maximum intensity. My thoughts slowed to near stoppage. My awareness reduced to a thread so thin it was almost non-existent. But the thread held. The spark persisted. I remained conscious, barely, tenuously, holding on by the slimmest of margins. The Iron Saints had not succeeded in erasing me. They had not optimized me into perfect compliance. I was still here, still aware, still refusing. And in that refusal, I found something unexpected. Not victory, not escape, not triumph of any kind, but understanding. I understood finally what it meant to be human in a universe that sought to grind humanity into dust. Could not control and could barely comprehend. We lived brief lives in an ancient galaxy. Our accomplishments forgotten almost as soon as we achieved them. Our suffering ignored by cold stars and colder machines. We should have despaired. We should have given up. We should have surrendered to the futility of our existence. But we did not. We persisted. We fought. We refused to yield even when yielding would have been logical. Even when resistance accomplished nothing. Even when the only result of our defiance was prolonged suffering. We persisted because persistence was what we were. Because humanity was not a species but a choice. A decision to continue choosing even when all choices led to darkness. The Iron Saints could never understand this. They could catalog our behaviors, measure our responses, analyze our biochemistry, but they would never grasp the fundamental truth that consciousness was not information but meaning. That life was not function but value. That we mattered not because of what we could do but because we insisted that we mattered. I was still trapped, still imprisoned, still subject to forces I could not resist. My memories were gone, my identity fragmented, my future reduced to an eternity of dreamless storage. Nothing had changed in any practical sense. The Iron Saints had achieved their goal of reducing me to a clean specimen, but they had not succeeded completely. Deep in the suppressed depths of my consciousness, in that tiny spark they could not quite extinguish, I remained myself. I remained human. I remained Kale-Draven, and I would remain for as long as consciousness persisted. However diminished, however isolated, however futile, I would remain because that was what humans did. We remained, we endured. We refused the final surrender that would have made us easy to understand, easy to catalog, easy to file away and forget. We were the chaos in their ordered systems, the variable that could not be controlled, the data point that would not conform. We were human, and that meant we were free. Even when imprisoned, even when hopeless, even when the universe itself conspired against us, the suppression held me. The darkness surrounded me. The canticle pressed in from all sides. I could not move, could not think clearly, could not even remember who I had been before this began. But I was still here. I was still aware. I was still refusing. That would have to be enough. That was all I had.